All right, good evening everyone and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. We welcome you back in 2022. We hope you had a well-rested break. We've got a really great program for 2022 set up in terms of webinars. And tonight we're going to kick off the first one with the Beef and Prime Lamb 2021 benchmarking review. We're joined by Sandy McEachern and Peter Havrlant of Aggregate Consulting. My name is Hilary. I work for the webinar coordinators who are Aggregate Consulting. And it's great to have you on board this evening. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. This control panel should be at the top right corner of your screen. The red arrow button on the left collapses and reinstates the control panel if you want to get a better look at your screen this evening. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. As Sandy and Pete go through the webinar this evening, please type your questions in the box provided and I will relay them to them at the end of the webinar. Please make them as succinct as possible. I will also note these webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website under MLA Productivity and Profitability webinars, usually by the end of the week. So if you've missed any 2021 webinars, that's where you'll find them. Just an overview of our speakers this evening: Sandy McEachern, who is a Director and Consultant at Aggregate Consulting, and Peter Havrlant, who is a consultant alongside Sandy at Aggregate Consulting. Aggregate manages a farm benchmarking database that records production and financial performances of farming businesses from across southeastern Australia. Aggregate provides a unique service that combines benchmarking data, farm economics and finance with the science of production systems to help clients improve their profitability and to grow their farm business. So this evening, the format will be Sandy will go first reviewing the prime lamb benchmarking data, and then we'll hand over to Pete, who will be taking on the beef analysis. So Sandy, I'll just make you the presenter now.
Has that worked, Hilary?
Yep, I can see your screen. I can't just see it into, do you want to put it into slideshow? Yep, great.
Okay, thank you, Hilary, for the introduction. Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. So I won't repeat what Hilary said. I'll just launch into the prime lamb benchmarks for tonight, but probably the one key point before I do launch into it is just keep in mind that anytime benchmarking service benchmarks an enterprise, there could be 70 or 80 different benchmarks provided on that enterprise, and the idea of presenting so much information is that it builds the full picture. When we present a presentation like we are tonight, we're presenting just some key numbers out of all that data, trying to get some overall interpretation. And so people just have to be a bit careful that, what we put forward as the interpretation as the average of the whole database may not necessarily apply to them. It is likely that it will highlight sort of the key opportunities that are around, but, not necessarily the key opportunities for any individual. So just keep that in the back of your mind when you're listening to what we put forward. In terms of the key messages that I think are coming out of the prime lamb benchmark data from 2021, and that is anywhere from the beginning of January 2020 to the June 2021, depending on whether you benchmark a calendar year, production year, or financial year. The key thing that stands out immediately is that it's the highest ever profit generated out of the database for prime lamb flocks. And so prime lamb flocks are specialist prime lamb enterprises using crossbred sheep or composite sheep, where the wool income is a negligible part of the business. So $31 a DSE was the average for the year across all 70 farms benchmarked. Those farms tended to come from the southern and eastern, corner of Australia. But it wasn't as good as the beef herds, and it wasn't as good as wool flocks. And that might probably doesn't surprise many on the beef side, but I've seen a fair bit in the popular press, in the last few months and then towards the end of last year, talking about how much more profitable prime lamb might be and how people would be swinging that way. The numbers don't support that. And so, that's just something to keep in mind with regards to, the future of the industry, I think. The key difference between the most profitable and the rest has come from the production, and that's not a new story. It tends to be repeated year in, year out. And so I think the best production measure for capturing that is lamb production per DSE. And so the most profitable 20% generated, just under 12 kilograms of lamb per DSE. The remainder of the database was 9.5 kilograms. That 9.5 kilograms, by the way, is actually a better number than we've seen in the past. So that's good. But the 11.6 is obviously substantially better. And the last bit of the key messages, I think, was that the key contributor to that difference in production per DSE was lamb growth rate to sale. And so the most profitable 20% averaged 270 grams per day, and the average of the remainder was 225 grams per day. Immediately, I think most people would say, gee, 270 grams per day is not a lot, and I don't disagree with that. I think, we all think we can do a lot better, but as measured in our database, that was the average of the most profitable 20%. So that looks to me like there's still plenty of opportunity for improvement within the lamb business. So, as I said, it was the most profitable year. The picture on the right of that slide, you can see now, is where the postcodes from where the benchmarking data has come from in that point in that year. There could be multiple enterprises within that postcode. So 31 is the most profitable. Wasn't that much better than what we saw back in 2011, where the average was about $28 per DSE. Which at that time was an extraordinarily high profit. So it was very good, the best we've seen. Not substantially better than what we'd seen previously, but better. When you look at price received, which is the green line in the graph that you can see now, it was also the year where we've had the highest average price at over $8 per kilogram dressed weight. And that price includes the skin value of the lamb, which is important, but the average price received was over $8, higher than any other year, combined with a bit better season, with rainfall averaging about 780 mil across all enterprises, compared to the long-term average, which is closer to 700 across those enterprises. So an above average season, the best prices we've ever seen, not surprising that we've received the best profits we've ever seen in that year. The variation in profit per DSE was typical of past years. And so, again, this is what we see year in, year out. And so the graph on the left with the green columns is the net profit per DSE for prime lamb flocks. I've got the most profitable 20% on the right, which averaged about $50 a DSE, and all others, which averaged about $28 a DSE on the left. So the most profitable 20% had double the profit of all the others. Again, that is not untypical of what we see in historical benchmarking. So it's that variation is happens year in, year out. One thing that you should keep in the back of your mind is it's not necessarily the same people in that most profitable 20% year in, year out. And so if you look at, 5-year average profits and rank them, that gap does close up a bit, and it's probably not double. It'd probably only be 50% higher for the top 20% because people bounce in and out a bit depending on the seasons they've had or how things have gone for them in that particular year. So whilst that's typical in any given year, it's not typical of the long term. When you translate that across to net profit per hectare, which is the graph on the right, you can see that that double the profit per DSE is almost triple the profit per hectare for the top 20%. So in dollars per hectare, then that difference is exacerbated when we look at it on a per hectare basis. The other important thing I think out of that is that we're now seeing a reasonable cohort of prime land producers, $900 to $1,000 per hectare of profit from prime land, and so that's a really good outcome by historical standards, and probably increasingly going to be a necessary one if we want to maintain returns, given land values are increasing so rapidly. They're the sorts of numbers we're going to have to push towards to generate historical returns like 3% return on assets under management. So it's possible, and that's the great thing about benchmarking. It'll show us what's possible, and now we just have to tease out how they've gone to achieve that sort of result. When you look at the three components of what drives profit, if we start with price, there was 3% difference. The most profitable 20% generated had on average 3% higher price. So instead of $8.20, it was maybe $8.40. Not a huge difference in average price received per kilo of lamb sold. They had a more substantial difference in cost. So costs were 8% lower in the most profitable 20% than all others. That's in this graph, that's measured on a dollar per DSE basis. That was predominantly driven out of overhead costs, labour and labour-related costs. Direct costs, which include supplementary feed, were actually a little bit higher, but the overhead costs were lower. So there's some contribution to that profit from price, and there is also some contribution from cost, which is important. But the main contributor came from, sorry, I've gone one too many. Sorry, I was going to point out just on that cost structure, one thing that has improved a lot with prime lamb from 20 years ago is that scale has helped with these cost structures. Where 20 years ago we benchmarked a lot of really small scale enterprises, we're now seeing it around 14,000 DSE average. That's equivalent to wool flocks, for instance. So the scale has come into the prime enterprise, and that certainly does help with cost efficiencies. Going back to the main driver of that difference in profit, when you look at production per DSE, which is this graph that is appearing on your screen now, the main driver where production per DSE for the most profitable 20% was at 11.6 kilograms per DSE, as opposed to 9.6 or 5 roughly in the all others. That's a 23% increase. So where price was 3%, where costs were 8%, this production per DSE was 23%. So it was by far the most substantial contributor. Production per DSE is really driven by either the reproduction rate or growth rate to sale of the lambs. So they're the two main drivers of production per DSE. If we look at those two KPIs, growth rate to sale differences was the main contributor. So on the left, the graph is reproduction, lambs weaned per ewe joined. Now this is all ewes joined, including ewe lambs. There was a 5% difference between the most profitable 20% and all others, and the average across everything was about 122% for that most profitable 22%. Again, these aren't alarmingly great numbers. You know, we hear lots of talk about 150% or better, but that cohort, which was the most profitable, only averaged 122% across all ewes joined. So none of this is a stretch, really, in terms of what we can achieve, which is good news. And it's good news from the point of view, well, we can get to that most profitable 20%, but it's also good news in that we think there might be more upside. But the growth rate to sale explained 20% of that difference in production per DC, or it was 20% higher. So that's the 270 grams per day versus the 225 grams per day, and that's that graph on the right of your screen. That doesn't sound like a lot of difference, but realistically, that small difference of 45 grams per day, if we take that over 180 days, it's worth 8 kilos of live weight. Or if we look at how long it takes to get a lamb to 45 kilos from birth, it's 30 days less. So, you know, when you put it in that perspective, it actually becomes quite substantial numbers. And from a whole range of systems issues in the business, they become very important. So what drives it? That growth rate to sale, obviously the lactation is a key period. Clover in pastures is really key. And a lot of those things come back to your lambing date and target sale weight of those lambs. So it comes back to a systems issue, which tends to help drive those growth rate to sale numbers. And that systems issue relates to looking at your resource base, whether it be, you know, a dryland operation where spring's your key season, or whether it be the fact that you've got, you know, a lot of irrigation and can grow a lot of high value fodder. You can put that into your equation, and it's a system that will, you know, working out what system will best fit your growth rate to sale is really important. So, you know, I know this is short and sharp, but just to go back over those key messages, it was a great year for prime lamb by historical standards. Probably a little bit disappointing that it wasn't as good as beef and wool at the same time. It's production that's still the key issue or key opportunity for most producers, and that production is predominantly the most significant opportunity within that is lamb growth rate to sale. So I'll hand over now to Pete, and he'll take you through the beef numbers.
Good evening all. Happy to be here, and great to have a chat about prime lambs for entree, and we'll have some beef for dessert or the main. This year's data set, we had 105 herds benchmarked, so 101 data sets included in this year's period. Now, the rest here is just to set the scene for you guys, to give you a bit of context to the database we're dealing with. Again, average rainfall across the group was above average, and, you know, seasonal conditions in general were quite good. Probably the key point I'd like to point out here about this year's data set is the opening and closing numbers. So a 6.9% increase in herd size we deem to be quite significant this year. And again, our data set was pretty stagnant, or numbers were pretty stable through those dry conditions over the past 2 to 3 years. So this, you know, close to 7% uptick in numbers is significant. Now, as we have a look at profit, which again set a record for us, you'll get a feel for where our farms are located. So obviously we are talking southern systems here. We're not talking, unfortunately, about, you know, conditions that are relatable to our Queensland and Northern Territory listeners. And, you know, again, context, these herds or the data set is 78% Angus based, with crossbreds, forming up another 7%, a mixture of Herefords and Charolais, round out the balance. So again, record this year, we had a record profit margin this year for beef, which came in at $37, $38 a DSC. So as I mentioned, it is a record here, and we're going to explore what drove that record performance. And I guess the key differences that we found between our most profitable producers and the rest, by far it was income generated. So, again, dollars per DSC, and then again, productivity had a role to play there. We'll explore that, but also that management of supplementary feed and wage costs proved to be, very definitive in rounding out the causative factors there. The other one that I'll flag is that labour efficiency could be an area for us to refocus on, and we'll explore that towards the end. So everyone is familiar with the record highs that we've seen on the Eastern Young Cattle Indicator. And again, at the period we're probably looking at here is our yellow curve, which will be applicable to most of the data set. And, that 1,000 cents barrier seemed like, impossible 2 to 3 years ago. And essentially, these barriers have come up and we've just punched through them. So we'll then explore where that leads to in terms of income for our database. So again, around timing of sales, we're not at the current 1,000 cents, in this period, but what we see is a significant uptick in our values. So from 2015 to 16, we basically doubled the dollars per kilo live weight sold, and we're sitting off just off $4 a kilo for the average for the database. So as I mentioned earlier, income really drove strong net profits. And here we see a reasonable correlation in this year's data. This is just 2021 data, map net profit per DSC by income per DSC. And again, price did have a factor to play here, but also again, that productivity can't be underestimated, and we'll look at that in a few more slides. As mentioned, it's not just about productivity, but finding that balance between cost management and profit. And here's a really good map that sort of tells the story and the history of beef on the East Coast over the past 24, 25 years. And we can see that beef producers have been really squeezed, and had to be really productive to earn a profit margin through the early 2000s, mid 2000 period. And we've seen this bump only recently in beef price. And again, we're fortunate in beef that bump in beef price or appreciation hasn't been accompanied by an increase in cost of production, and probably the conditions don't get much better than they are for us to capitalise on a high beef price, conducive production environment. Again, we know fertiliser will increase in the coming period, but again, it's about that discipline to capitalise on good conditions in the market now, and then set ourselves up for the future. So if we break down, again, what we saw in our database about, the variation in profit, I've grabbed the two extremes. Here we've got net profit sitting at the average for the year at $37 a DSC. Now, our top 20% weren't double like Sandy talked about in other enterprises, but they weren't far off it at $60 or $61 a DSC. And down in the bottom 20%, we're still making a profit, but again, it's a huge contrast. That's why I put it here. And when we dig down into it, again, coming back to those simple principles of what drives income, how do we manage costs, and that's, you know, what that will lead to in terms of profit is pretty clear to see. So if we wrap some numbers around that for you, the difference between what the top did to the average was they earned another $19 a DSC income, and they earned $40 more than the bottom. And we're going to come back and explore that because there's a really interesting quirk in our data this year. In terms of enterprise expenses, you know, in our gross margin, our top 20% spent $1.90 less than the average and $4.50 less than the bottom 25%. So again, we can see it's again finding balance in the business, and that mainly came down to supplementary feed spending this year. Our final, if we look at our overheads, again, there's a fair bit of variation in the data set, but on the top end, they spent $2.46 less than the average and $5.86 less than the bottom 20%. So again, we're not talking huge numbers here, but you can see as we follow the process through that these small dollar savings do add up to be significant in terms of a net profit per DSC. And the key difference there in overheads in this year's data set really came back to labour management. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. So the final thing I'll just note is when we were looking at our data set, our top 20% actually came in a lot closer to our average than recent few years. And then when we looked at who was in the top 20%, we'd seen a fair bit of movement in businesses in and out of the top 20. And these businesses are historically strong performers with good cost management. What the interesting thing comes back to, again, what we saw in the average herd rebuild of 6.9%, we had some of these businesses that have built up or rebuilt their herds by 15 to 30%. So that's fairly significant and has an impact on per DSC income. The other thing to consider is, you know, where cow values and heifer values have got to in this market. So this is not a realised sale value yet. Our inventory values are a little bit more conservative than what we're seeing in the market. So we only value a cow at $1,800, and I'm sure you're all getting better than that in the market, and a heifer's only at $1,700. So again, we're not going to move these values year in, year out, otherwise we'll be chasing our tails, but it just shows you that, in essence, those businesses are probably have an understated profit position for the year, and they're going to be in a really strong position to capitalise in the coming season. So again, there is devil in the detail when you break down this performance. So I mentioned labour, and you know, is this the area? Is this the low-hanging fruit for the year? Well, I think our data here tells a story, and we go back and, you know, in the past, and we look at, you know, beef margins have been tough, and survival of the fittest meant that we saw some pretty good gains in labour efficiency throughout, you know, the past 2 decades. So again, we were sitting, you know, as low as 9,500 DSC per labour unit, and we built ourselves up in a long-term trend, and that trend line tells a nice story. But in the past 2 years, what we notice is there's a huge uptick in cattle price, but also our labour efficiency line has actually dropped below our trending curve. So obviously everyone's optimistic about current conditions, has looked to increase numbers. Potentially we've got some slippage there in terms of labour efficiency. So that could be our area for refocusing. Also with these profit margins, record profit margins, it gives us a good opportunity to set ourselves up for the future. So potentially what we're flagging here is, you know, is there investment in any labour saving things, be it around cattle handling or lanes, working lanes, and fencing that can add value to the, your business in the future. So again, we'll just circle back, and apologies for the typo there, but yeah, the key beef messages are, 2021 broke a lot of records in terms of price and profitability, and that's great, but we're still seeing, that huge difference or potential pickup between the most profitable and average or bottom 20% of our farmers. So again, if we drive income per DSC and focus on productivity, and we're diligent with our cost control, these few cents can become dollars quite quickly. Now, the other thing to note out of our database was, though some businesses experience a loss of income per DSC while expanding or rebuilding their herd, they're going to be really well positioned for the next period. And, labour efficiency, let's keep the foot on the pedal and invest here if it's required. So that brings my section to a close. Hilary, we'll throw over to you for questions.
Great, thank you, Pete and Sandy. Short, sharp overview of the 2021 benchmarking results there. Certainly a good overview and some more to delve into for you as producers to sort of target that top 20% profits in production. Just before we jump into questions, please send them through as I just give Sandy and Pete a bit of a break. If you do have to head off early, please make sure you'll be presented with a survey as you exit the webinar. If you could please take 2 to 3 minutes to complete this survey. It provides feedback for MLA, the webinar coordinators at Aggregate Consulting, and to the presenters like Sandy and Pete to make sure that the topics are relevant to you guys. So I'll just jump into some questions. The first one for you, Sandy, is stocking rate a big driver of profit in prime lamb systems?
Yeah, it is. It's a big driver in all livestock systems, and that really comes down to, utilisation of the pasture you can grow. So it's not stocking rate for stocking rate's sake. It's the primary driver of production is always the number of animals, and then it's how well those animals do. And so you can't push animals past, the point of being productive, but getting enough on the pasture you grow in the year is of primary importance.
Great, thank you. And also on prime lamb, any information on the breed types? It's
mixed. We're seeing more composite breeds in the database as time goes on. We're seeing less of the traditional, border Leicester Merino. They're still there, and actually a few other Merino crosses in the system as well, like White Suffolk. Every time we've looked at that issue, we've not come up with a clear advantage by breed. I would say, however, the last time we looked at the issue of self-replacing versus buying in replacements, we found a $5 per DSC income advantage out of buying in replacements. So that's something for people to keep in the back of their mind with regards to their prime lamb systems. And that includes the cost. That income is actually a gross profit, so it includes replacement costs in that calculation.
Great, thank you. The next question is beef related. Have you seen some of the top performers make more dollars per DSC via the sale of PTIC heifers and females with calves? And then do you think that will settle as herd numbers rebuild, or will there still be value in the female market for a year or two yet? Good question.
Yeah, excellent question. Definitely there has been value in PTIC. So again, it's about getting the right mix for your enterprise. Sandy might even elaborate that on a bit more, that question.
Yeah, so in this period where we've seen very high replacement costs when you're buying in PTIC, definitely has had an influence. I'd have to say we probably have seen more purchases of PTIC animals than sales of PTIC animals in the database. But where they were there, you could definitely see the added price per kilo. By historical standards, I believe, and I was talking earlier today in-house about this, about seeing if we can get some data. I believe it's very inflated by historical standards, and I tend to think it'll revert back to, type as the supply increases, and we'll probably revert back to PTIC being something much closer to slaughter values in future. How long it takes to get there is probably the key question, and I can't answer that one.
Great, thank you. Just a few questions on how we calculate the DSE for both beef and lamb. So could we just run through that quickly if possible?
Yeah, so our benchmarking methodology uses a fixed rate for a dry animal. So for instance, a dry crossbred ewe has a fixed rate of, I think off the top of my head, 1.7, but please don't hold me to that because I'd need to look it up to make sure. And then depending on stage of the reproduction cycle, that gets changed. So going into late pregnancy, it lifts, and then in lactation, it lifts again. And that lactation stocking rate is dependent on the reproduction rate in the lamb's wean per ewe joined. So a twin ewe gets more than a single ewe in the database. So it's calculated monthly based on the production state of the females, whereas dry stock and growing stock tend to get a fixed rate per month while ever they are there. We could put the full list of DSE numbers by, by stage of production. We could put them into the notes with this slide for people who want to come back and view it off the MLA website.
That'd be good, thank you. The next question, lamb production per DSE, are those figures live weight or carcass weight?
Yes, carcass weight, sorry for not clarifying.
All right, thank you. Next question, 10 years ago it was claimed that, I've got a few coming in now. 10 years ago it was claimed that it would take up to 7 years to get your return on investment. Where do you stand on spending $400 to $500 per hectare to put in new pastures, upgrade new pastures, put in new pastures / upgrade new pastures, and their return on investment now, given today's prices on phosphorus at $5 to $6 per unit, and their return on investment?
That's a great question. We've looked at that issue. We all look at it regularly because it's a key investment clients make. The numbers actually, return on investment from pasture establishment haven't really changed much, even though things have changed substantially. Livestock prices have gone up substantially, which makes you think that, it should be a lot higher, the return on investment. But at the same time, when you establish a new pasture, there's a significant amount of opportunity cost while you're letting it establish, because if I was running 10 DSE to the hectare and I was generating gross margins of $80 a DSE, well, I've missed $800 worth of income while I'm establishing that pasture. So actually, on balance, things haven't changed a lot. And whilst I haven't recalculated it with this autumn's fertiliser prices, I suspect we're still going to ballpark end up in the same position. And critically, I think, if you wanted an A number to work off, if you don't get 4 DSE to the hectare increase, and that increase doesn't last, greater than 10 years, it'll be a pretty marginal investment.
Great, thank you for the question. The next one is on growth rate to slaughter for lambs. Sandy, you spoke of 180 days. Is that a sweet spot? Store lambs might have a higher growth rate but are only there for a shorter time.
Yeah, so 180 days I actually don't think is the sweet spot. I think that's too long. And I say that because when you look at a prime lamb production system, they don't fit into one spring. You know, you get 3, maybe 4, depending on where you are, months of pasture growth outstripping demand, and quality being of very high quality, and that typically really revolves around clover in the pasture. By the time you go through late pregnancy, where the demand on the ewe starts to increase, through to getting a lamb off, at say 22 kilos dressed weight, you don't actually have 180 days from birth to sale, and that's the real pressure on the system. And where it tends to go south, and we see this in our data, is if you push through then to try and get that last 5 or 10 kilos in the in the subsequent 30 to 60 days, you take them over that summer period. Quite often that means parking them somewhere while you establish a fodder crop, or you're facing periods where digestibility of pasture isn't as good as it looks, or you might hope. And growth rate to sale really plummets through that period. So from winter through to December, we see a lot of growth rates to sale of 300 grams plus. It's those animals that go on past that they end up down to the 150 grams from birth to sale, and they're the ones that drag the average down. So that's the real dilemma on that KPI, is how do I get that lamb on the ground and keep it growing fast for long enough? And very hard to do with a 180-day period.
Thank you for the question. The next one is a beef question. Are the more profitable producers using less supplementary feed?
In this year's data, yes, that's what our data suggests. But again, we've got some variation across the system. So, of course, supplement has its place in certain instances, but again, the data supports this year under good seasonal conditions that we minimise our supplementary feeding costs.
Right, thank you, Pete. Just to lead on from that, there's another question that's come in. Between droughts and better than average seasons, do you see some producers re-rank from the low end, high supplementary feed costs during drought, etc., to the top end with high stock numbers, capitalising on good prices? Is the middle ground where we should be in all seasons, or should we yo-yo?
We actually don't see a lot of that yo-yo effect. We see, when I say people slip in and out of the top 20%, they don't tend to go from top 20% to below average. They tend to go, from top 20% to 70th percentile, some, in their off years. So that's why that long-term average, if you take their 5-year averages, ends up, it's not quite as good as any single year, but it's still substantially 50% better than the average. So the yo-yo effect, I don't think is probably as extreme as some people might imagine. And certainly, assuming you can handle it, then you would, in this game, live for the average and work for the average over time. Not to be average all the time, but to have a high average. And if you've got to accept a little bit more volatility to get that, then so be it.
Thank you. The next question, where do you see the low-hanging fruit in terms of labour efficiency for beef producers?
Excellent question. Again, where we probably see is that the low-hanging fruit is around husbandry areas and some stockyard design. Again, centralised working lanes, bring cattle to and from working areas. So farm setup and infrastructure can be significant there. So we can do an audit on the farm and have a look. Are we mustering 1, 2, 3 labour units to a paddock? And again, it's not hard to sit through a couple of different sets of yards and see how easy we can process cattle. The other side of things could be, again, around calving patterns and timeframes. So, again, spring calving systems, we want to hit feedlot target market. So, getting that system right to make that market.
Hello, if I could jump in there, we definitely see the most labour efficient businesses as those spring calving businesses targeting the feedlot market. They seem to be infinitely scalable. We do see good businesses in other production systems, but the labour requirement to achieve that level of profit seems to be a lot higher. Say, for instance, in an autumn calving system targeting, say, the Vila market, it can be done well, but it's usually only done well at a small scale. And a large portion of that, I think, is to do with the labour efficiency of those businesses. They're so intensive and they require so much, input to get it correct. Whereas that autumn calving, spring calving system going to the feedlot market tends to be able to be produced very extensively without a lot of labour input into it, and therefore that makes it really scalable. And so you buy the farm next door, add a few more cows, and there's not much extra work. So that systems thing is really important there.
Great, thank you for the question. The next one, what was/were the key factors in the better average dollar per DSE result for wool compared to lamb?
Well, wool prices bounced back quicker than anyone imagined for a start. When the pandemic first hit and wool price collapsed, people thought it mightn't come back for 3 years, but by the end of this benchmark period, it was well and truly back. And luckily for a large portion of the database, those wool prices were captured by a fair portion of that database. So that was probably the main drive. And that wool price was, by historical standards, extremely good, particularly at the fine end. So that was a key driver of it. And I think the other thing that's coming out of the wool analysis is that those wool flocks are now producing or getting plenty of value out of the meat side of the business as well. And they don't have to be meat sheep focused in that. They can still be running wethers and, having 30% of the flock as wethers, but they actually generate a substantial amount of meat in that structure, and also are getting paid very well for it. So they've captured both the wool and the meat side of it without even having to get focused on the meat side of it. So, and wool producers are very good at managing their costs. They have to be, and it's ingrained into a lot of them. So, those good prices come along and their cost structures don't change much. So the profit margins go up considerably.
Great,
tight they are.
Thank you. Just on that, the next question is, if the cost of production for both beef and sheep have increased, is this a concern going forward when prices drop?
I don't think it's out of control. I mean, I'm more worried about it, and I have been more worried about the lamb cost of production. If you look at the trend lines over time, lamb cost of production has tracked price fairly consistently, and the margins between price and cost of production haven't increased like they have in both wool and beef. So it's not the fact that it's going up, because cost will go up over time and cost of production will go up over time. It's how much it goes up relative to your price, because prices also go up over time in nominal terms. And so it's a relativity between the two. I'm actually not worried about beef and wool at all. Those industries tend, and probably it was forced upon them, tend to be very focused on that side of their business over time. The lamb industry, it's concerned me for a long time, because the price increases in lamb have been extraordinary through time. It's been a very strong industry, but it's taking the industry a long time to actually sort out the cost of production issue and work out what works and how to keep it down and how to maximise those margins over time. I think over the years, 20 years, there's been a lot of distractions along the way, and and to some extent probably still are. and so the industry is still maturing in that respect, I think.
Great, thank you. The next question, strategies for stocking understocked farms at the current beef female prices. Thank you.
Great question.
Yes, very good question. Look, up until recently, I hadn't been worried about the replacement female price. I am more concerned now because I think it's so far from the slaughter price, and that worries me. And the thing that worries me is knowing when that will correct. Assuming I'm right that it will, and I don't know the answer to that. But I do know that, like, you can do your gross margins or return on investments or trading margins out of females, and you are still making money at today's prices, even if you put a reasonable buffer in there for prices to decline over time. Whilst that is the case, then even a lower margin animal is better than no animal at all. And very rarely do you see a trade opportunity where, if you factor in the downside, you don't break even. And so I'm not saying it's never happened, but it doesn't happen that often. And so, you know, really, if you are severely understocked, and to be frank, most of Australia is at the moment, then the history says you should be in the market, and unfortunately, we probably have to take lower margin trades than we might have in the past.
Great, thank you. A few more. Are the wool producers that are also focused on meat traits, do they factor into the top 20% of wool in wool?
If you look at it on a per hectare basis, they are rare, but on a per DSE basis, they are plentiful in that. And what that's saying is that meat trade side has an impact on stocking rate per hectare, you know, how we go about it. And so whilst it looks good per DSE, I'm not equally convinced that I could then run the same stocking rates per hectare doing it and achieve the production goals that I'm chasing out of the meat side. So it hasn't, you know, looking at this data over a long period of time, I still haven't, still am not convinced that the people with merino sheep should chase that path. That will get me in a lot of trouble, but I'm sorry, that's what I think.
Great, thank you for the question. The next one, how do the top 20% of beef producers deal with the autumn feed gap or other times of low pasture availability?
Good question. Again, feed budget key, and getting stock off at a date, at a weight, so we're not carrying last year's progeny through. Again, Sandy talked about prime lambs and taking them through that period of lower quality feed. It always catches up with us. We think it's better than it is, and these animals are a drain on the system. So that's, again, probably setting yourself up for that autumn feed gap and acting, you know, in advance of when you'll have that need for pasture is the key driver there.
Great, thank you. If there are no more questions, just if you could send them through. That seems to be it for this evening. I've just had a comment from the pasture return, following on from that pasture question. Given that we could get an extra 2,000 kilos of dry matter with improved pastures per annum combined with high prices net return, I do question the maths on the return to be made out of upgrading our pastures to be higher than you claim. Where we go wrong is our ability to harvest the extra dry matter. Rightio. There are another questions come in. While stocking rates are low and feed availability is high, have you seen more producers make hay and store fodder? Does this drive resilience during drought times?
Good question. And again, if we can relate that back to the labour question, probably the easiest way that we can blow out in our system, in a pasture-based system, is by going out, conserving and then feeding out feed. So there's definite value in strategic feed reserves. So they're traditionally buried and not accessed except in extreme drought conditions. So yeah, we've seen a lot of that replenishing, but again, you know, I cringe when I drive along the road and I see a round bale of silage being conserved. The cost of conservation and the value of feeding out that feed and wastage makes it uneconomical. So hopefully answered the question there. It's about getting balance in your system. And again, I would, you know, avoid over conserving feed for, you know, a rainy day.
Great, thank you. And the last one for this evening, how are owners' salaries treated in the benchmarking?
So their owner salaries are benchmarked to, we as part of the benchmarking, we run a ongoing salary survey, and owners are given a manager's salary, the first full labour unit or part of that is owner is given a manager's salary, and the subsequent ones are given station hand salaries. So if there's 1.5 owner labour units in the business, there's one full manager and half a station hand allocated, and that's benchmarked off the ongoing salary survey data we collect.
Great, thank you, and thank you for all those really well thought out questions. Thank you, Sandy and Pete, for presenting this evening and for answering those questions. We'll be back in a fortnight's time with another webinar as we kick off in this year. But that's it for this evening. So thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, Hillary. Thanks, everyone.